So recently I conducted a bit of a self-experiment where I was eating 5,793 calories for a high-carb, low-fat diet of fake foods. And during that time I actually put on 7 kilos. And that might not be a surprise to many people, but a few months earlier I conducted another 5,000 calorie experiment. I was eating the same amount of calories, but of a high-fat, low-carb diet of real food. I actually only put on a kilo. And in fact, I actually lost 3 centimetres from my waist, which is really interesting. So, firstly, what are your thoughts on those different numbers, despite being the same amount of calories?
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting experiment, Sam, and although anecdotal, actually in many ways fits in with a lot of scientific consensus or scientific research that may support or explain what happened to you. So the first thing is, we have been sort of for decades, there is a kind of acceptance, which I think is being naive, about all calories being the same. And we know there are lots of studies actually that show that, if you consume calories more from carbohydrates, they may actually contribute to weight gain. And without going into a lot of detail, a lot of it is based upon response of insulin. And the body insulin is a fat storing hormone. We also know that fat, to some degree actually, consuming higher fat diets, but more specifically we talk about traditional foods that are high in unsaturated fat, because we know they are definitely positive cardioprotective effects of that. There is greater energy expenditure by the body, and they're metabolized probably in a different way to carbohydrates. It's probably more important than the obesity problem. And the obesity problem is an issue, but what the obesity problem does is, by just concentrating on body weight, we actually miss a whole cohort of people, a group of people, that will still suffer from diet-related disease, but may have a normal body mass index. And what I'm talking about here is what we call the metabolic syndrome. Now, the metabolic syndrome is really a kind of a group of conditions together. Specifically, 3 of 5 which involve high blood pressure, impaired glucose tolerance, or really to some degree type 2 diabetes, increased triglycerides in the blood, low HDL, with low good cholesterol, and increased waist circumference. And 40% of people who develop the diseases of the metabolic syndrome have a normal body mass index. But to put it in greater perspective for the population, to give an example of how important this is, 75% of US healthcare dollars are actually spent on treating the diseases of the metabolic syndrome. So this is something that's extremely prevalent, extremely important, and very much influenced by diet.
Absolutely. And in this second experiment where I was eating these 5,000 calories of fake foods, I actually did some blood tests as well.
Sure.
So I'm going to hand it over to you. And what are your thoughts from day 1 to day 21 to start with?
So let's start from the beginning. So interestingly, your total cholesterol from day 1 before you adopted the high carbohydrate, low fat diet was about 5.3. Which is, kind of borderline for what is conventionally considered normal cholesterol. And after 21 days of the high carbohydrate, low fat diet, perhaps not surprisingly, your total cholesterol dropped very slightly from 5.3 to 5.1. And we know that fat, generally specifically saturated fat, has been, there's no doubt that it's implicated in raising what we call the LDL cholesterol. But I'll come back to that in a second. And obviously with you reducing your saturated fat within that time, your total cholesterol did drop slightly. However, when you look at HDL, which is the good cholesterol, that started at 1.59 and actually dropped significantly really to 1.09. So the good cholesterol dropped, even though your total cholesterol went down slightly, your good cholesterol dropped. But one thing again, which is extremely interesting, and again does keep with the science about refined carbohydrates and influencing triglycerides, is your triglycerides quadrupled, essentially, almost quadrupled. So 0.52 millimoles per litre to 2.07. And that's quite alarming and quite interesting. Interestingly, although your total cholesterol, your LDL cholesterol drops a little bit, there was actually some concerning markers of what we describe as really atherogenic dyslipidemia. So atherogenic dyslipidemia basically means that the cholesterol profile actually is probably more important than total cholesterol in what may damage heart arteries. So actually your experiment does fit with scientific data, and in fact is what was expected, that your total cholesterol did drop slightly, but what was more concerning is your good cholesterol went down dramatically, and the triglycerides, which are a marker of the metabolic syndrome, went up.
Absolutely. It just goes to show that lower isn't always better.
Absolutely.
Is it? You have to look at the ins and outs and the real detail
Yes.
of a proper cholesterol profile to understand whether or not it's a good thing or a bad thing.
And that's why I think that the adoption of the so-called low-fat dogma has paradoxically worsened the problem of the obesity epidemic and the metabolic syndrome.